right, so many of you who maybe are newer to this, there may be some kind of overlap of words that may cause some confusion. So there is this idea of engaged Buddhism. Maybe not strictly, maybe as a term, I think engaged Buddhism is more of a modern word, a modern kind of concept. Whereas engaged bodhicitta, which is an aspect of a practice of Mahayana Buddhism, is a very, very old, not just idea, but series of practices, a framework of practice, and so forth. So engaged bodhicitta is an aspect of, in Mahayana Buddhism, we talk about bodhicitta as bodhicitta in aspiration and bodhicitta in action, or aspirational bodhicitta and engaged bodhicitta. Bodhicitta means the mind of enlightenment, and it is the kind of commitment, or the wish, you could say, to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. So then with that aspiration, the engaged aspect is all the kind of practices that one might do in order to fulfill that aspiration or that pledge of bodhicitta. So traditionally that is talked about as the practices of the six perfections, which are the practice of generosity, ethical discipline, patience, diligence, meditative concentration, and the perfection of wisdom. So those are called the six perfections, or the six paramitas. So engaging in that is referred to then as engaged bodhicitta, because those are the aspects that one would engage in to fulfill that pledge of freeing beings from suffering and bringing them to the state of enlightenment. And on the other side, we have this maybe more modern concept of engaged Buddhism, which obviously can have some overlap with those practices of the six perfections, but has its own kind of understanding in the world of Buddhism. So maybe Joshua could say a few words about that.
Yes, thank you, Justin, and welcome friends who are gathered together in Missoula and joining us from all parts of the world. I had the gift of somebody turning me on to a Buddhist ecologist teacher named Joanna Macy. I imagine some of you know Joanna. She's, I believe she's 95 or 96 now, but she's been one of the leaders of engaged Buddhism in North America for decades now, and so I have studied closely with her. She's been a big influence on me. And it really was through Joanna Macy's work that I learned about this movement of Buddhists called engaged Buddhism. And as Justin said, I think you can likely find expressions and examples of engaged Buddhism, from the Buddha himself, and then throughout, all the generations of Buddhists that have come after. But really, it was Thich Nhat Hanh, again, probably a teacher that many of you know to some degree. Thich Nhat Hanh really popularized this term of engaged Buddhism, especially during the Vietnam War, with all of the efforts that he and his fellow monks were a part of in Vietnam, caring for people and communities in Vietnam. And then out of that work, Thich Nhat Hanh became just obviously a beloved Buddhist teacher on our planet, but really a leader, someone who worked closely with Dr. King and many other spiritual activists who are really bringing compassion into action in the world. So engaged Buddhism, it's I would call it a sub-movement, right, within the Buddhist sector. And there are many Buddhist leaders, teachers, Buddhist organizations who self-identified as hey, we're part of this engaged Buddhism movement. They are Buddhists that are working to bring about social, political, and environmental well-being. And I think the last thing I'll say about engaged Buddhism, it's in its contemporary expression, it has more of this worldly focus, right? So not that there's any problem with doing a 3-year retreat, or spending your life in deep practice, seeking your own personal enlightenment. But for engaged Buddhism, there's a strong focus on how do we live our own personal fullest expression of ourselves. how do we bring our individual gift into the world, but also how do we help bring about collective enlightenment? And I think there's even a sense that that's possible, right? Even in the brokenness, and I know our hearts weigh heavy with all that's happening in the world, but a global awakening, right? A collective enlightenment is possible in these times, and definitely in the generations, right, who are coming ahead of us. So let me pause there. That's just a high-level initial introduction to engaged Buddhism.
Lovely. Thanks, Justin and Joshua. Justin, I want to make sure before we hop into our more like moderated portion, was there anything that sparked for you in what Joshua said that you wanted to respond to?
This is just nitpicky, but I'm just going to nitpick one word, in that the one little way that Joshua characterized maybe the traditional approach would be to stay in retreat for seeking your own enlightenment, which is not necessarily the case in a Mahayana context, that someone could spend their whole life in retreat, but from a Mahayana perspective, and particularly from a perspective of viewing things on a multi-lifetime perspective and not only this lifetime perspective, from one perspective, it could be argued, and would be argued in a lot of traditional Buddhist texts, that it is just as, if not potentially more beneficial, to spend your whole life in retreat for the benefit of others, like seeking enlightenment for the benefit of others, than it would be to be in the world as an unenlightened being, trying to help in your own way. So just to put that out there, just as a point of contrast, or like a little subtlety there. Yeah.
We can always count on a translator to be very particular about language. Good. This is great. All right, so let's go ahead and hop in. So our first question is, how can Tibetan Buddhist teachings on compassion and interdependence guide our actions in the world? And so I'll give it to Justin to start us off.
Okay. So to begin with, often, the teachings that we give or receive as Tibetan Buddhist students are talking about compassion, and it depends. In the Tibetan Buddhist context particularly, we would be speaking of compassion in the context of bodhicitta, or as a method for developing bodhicitta. So not merely as a feeling of like, oh, that's too bad, or I feel pity, or something like that, but a genuine wish to free beings from suffering, and not just temporary, immediate sense of suffering, but to bring them to the state of enlightenment, which would mean to completely eliminate even the causes of their suffering. And not only that, but bring them to a state where they can bring the maximum benefit to the world. And so compassion is talked about in that sense as, not exactly an end in and of itself, but in another context, it is the natural expression of the enlightened mind as well. But as an unenlightened person, it's something we have to develop more step by step, or more intentionally through some methods of practice. So, for example, by imagining maybe first someone who you feel very close to, and imagining their suffering and developing a really powerful wish to free them from that suffering, and meditating in that way, and then developing that until that becomes a powerful, like, real lived experience, and then expanding that out to others, to maybe people who are in your whole network of friends and family, co-workers and so forth, then even more outwards to your entire city, state, country, the entire world, countless worlds, and so forth. So we have a practice of the four immeasurables, or the four boundless thoughts, which is a way of developing that in a way, out to infinite beings. And so, whereas, in just the teachings on compassion alone, the emphasis is more on developing that attitude. And then if you have that attitude, hopefully that starts reflecting in your action. However, when we start talking about bodhicitta, meaning kind of the more fuller expression of compassion, compassion alone, it does not define bodhicitta. There has to be the wish for the full enlightenment of all beings. That's the additional factor that distinguishes bodhicitta from mere compassion. And in that context, then, along with this aspirational bodhicitta, which is that wish to free beings from suffering and bring them to enlightenment, there are these aspects of engagement of the six perfections, as I mentioned before. And those could start to become reflected in various ways, because also they could start on a very small level, like the aspect of generosity. In some texts, they talk about, I forget if this is from a sutra or what, but it's talked about that, there was, I think it was a king in ancient India who was so miserly that he couldn't even give anything to anyone. And the Buddha taught him to start just handing things from one hand to the other and imagining he was giving it to someone. And so it can be as simple as, or as low level you might think of as a simple gift of handing something from one hand to the other, building up to giving someone some food, a morsel of food, building up to, not only giving some material things, but giving protection from fear, giving the Dharma. There are different ways that generosity is talked about, the generosity of giving material things, the generosity of giving protection from fear, generosity of giving the gift of the Dharma, protection from fear also, that it depends upon the individual's way of engaging with that teaching. Some people will feel like giving protection from fear is just, you see a snail or a worm on the road and you put it back into some moist dirt or something like that. For other people, that could mean fully expressing that in terms of protesting against certain wars or protecting beings who are unhoused, or that could express itself in many ways, and those are not as explicitly talked about in the tradition as you should do this or that. You should go in your community and feed people. You should go in your community and protest against war or any kind of atrocities in the world or something like that. So it's more to the individual in terms of how they might express those teachings on generosity, for example. That's just one example of the six perfections, these different aspects of traditional, frameworks of practice. But it would be maybe up to the individual about how they would express that. In terms of interdependence, to come around to that, there are more and more discussions about the principle of interdependence in the greater worldview. I think it's even just common knowledge, people, the butterfly effect and all these kind of things. People talk about that in pop culture. But also a lot of teachers like Namchak Rinpoche often talks about the idea of collective karma. Thinking of that from the perspective that if all of us are contributing to a really consumer society and not really checking our own sense of, contentment and, having enough, what's enough, and all of us as a collective effort continuing to feed into this, it's never enough kind of consumer society is destroying the world and destroying the environment. So, rather than explicitly saying things like you shouldn't do this or that, or you should buy organic things and you should buy less things or whatever, people like Namchak Rinpoche will just point to the kind of the reality of what we're doing and what is happening in that. And he, just as a character, is a Lama who's less likely to explicitly say you don't do this or don't do that. He'll maybe point to our reality that certain things we're doing is creating, and leave it to you to maybe interpret and then make some changes in your own life about how you might try to do something more positive or express that in your own way. Joshua, you wanna? Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Justin. I'm gonna build on Justin in a different way. I want to speak more towards how Tibetan Buddhist practices, and really just Buddhist practice generally, support my actions in the world and how I see it supporting others. So, again, I'll start just with the personal narrative of I found Namchak at a time when I was burning out as a young activist. I had been working hard for years, trying to run a nonprofit, just in the hustle of trying to keep a nonprofit alive. And I was working hard with so many of my peers just to create change. And in all my youthful idealism, just really wanting change to happen a lot faster than change often does. Sometimes it is swift. We all have seen incredible moments of fast change, but change is also often slow. But I came to Tibetan Buddhist practice really as a burning out activist. I wasn't burnt out yet, but I was burning out. And I wasn't, even though I was rooted in my spirituality, I really wasn't engaging in enough daily practice. And so for me, Buddhist practice, one, it just helped me rest and recover my energies. And hopefully we all have a taste of that when we're, in our practice groove. And it just helps our overall balance and well-being, right? And our kind of mental at easeness, right? With being alive in this world. I think as I got deeper into the Tibetan Buddhist teachings and practices, I also just discovered more levity and lightheartedness, right? Again, as someone who's awake to so much suffering on this planet, who, has experienced it, but, witnesses it everywhere I look, it's heartbreaking, and it creates grief and heaviness, when we hold the pain of the world so tight and so close. And as I began to experience more personal freedom, right, through my Buddhist practice, I still felt a lot of passion, about creating change in the world, but I found a lot more openness, in the way I went about it, and a lot more openness and how I thought about outcomes, right, and how change unfolds. So for me, Tibetan Buddhist practice, it fills me with compassion and also wisdom, right, from the Buddhist teachings of interdependence, and even understanding that truly the emptiness of it all as well, and the impermanence of it all, that freedom gives me so much more spaciousness around how I act in the world. And then just one practical one that I hope some of you have experienced this, but just a recent story. So Don Glenn is phenomenal at building, our compassion muscles. And I was recently spending time with family, and I'll out myself politically. I was spending time with family that was half filled with Trump voters. As passionate as I am, right, about maybe opposite causes and cares. But what I noticed, just in this recent week being with family, is I was able to maintain my love and connection with these family members. I was able to listen and hear their viewpoints. I was able to slow not only myself down, but I was able to slow our shared conversations down if ever they would start to escalate. We all know how that it can happen quick. Those trigger points come. There was just something beautiful possible in our conversation that never would have been possible in my life before. So I just felt called to share that practical example of the benefits of Tibetan Buddhist practice in my own life.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing, Joshua. And just wanted to check in before we move on to our next question. Justin, anything that sparked for you, and we'll continue to.
Yeah, this is like maybe touching on the theory behind what Joshua is saying, but it is talked about, in traditional texts, even on the six perfections, that, even in the ceremony for taking the bodhisattva vow, one of them is that I will follow in the footsteps of the other bodhisattvas, but it says step by step, gradually. So it doesn't mean dive in head first, forget about my own capacities or my own boundaries, and forget, dive straight into a situation that I'm not able to deal with, but to take it where you are. And as you do more practice, that builds that capacity, like Joshua was saying, to be able to experience maybe a bit more peace, a bit more tranquility, a bit more insight that allows you to have a greater capacity in the type of engaged actions, whatever that might express itself for the individual in terms of how they're expressing their engagement in the world. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Justin. All right, so moving on to our next question we have here. What are some practical steps individuals can take to apply these teachings in their daily lives and communities? And this time we'll start with Joshua.
Great, thank you. So, again, I want to speak to especially those of you who are looking to become more actively engaged in the world and in your community. And I just want to honor. I have a feeling many of you already are, and that's why you might feel called to join in a conversation like this tonight. And some of you may just be stepping in that direction, and some of you may be questioning, like, oh, actually, is that part of who I am and who I want to be, and does that actually, fit with my practice commitments? It's always a hard thing to know where do I start. Like if I have this like just general core sense of like I want to help make a difference. I want to be a positive force on our planet, but there's so many problems everywhere. Like the issues are countless. People use this interesting word nowadays called the poly crisis, right? There's just multiple crises that we're facing in these times. And how do we get at the root cause, of human suffering? And for sure, we know that there is a personal journey we can all take, to really liberate ourselves spiritually. And that's, the huge gift of the Buddha and the Buddhist path. And there are so many other forms of suffering, right? Political, social, economic, and then, of course, all of the environmental challenges that our planet is facing and that we're, directly experiencing. So where do we start? And there's a voice in my head that from a woman, I'm forgetting her name, but she always said, start with one thing. Don't try to do everything. Don't try to solve everything, but start with one thing. And I don't know about you, but often along with finding peace and tranquility and compassion in my meditation practice, I also receive inner guidance, right? From that internal wisdom that we all have inside, right? So I really like to encourage people to just trust your inner guidance, and in the times when you are sitting with yourself or walking with yourself, right? We find the guidance that leads us in the direction, right, where we need to go. And that's just as true with taking action in the world. I want to also, I want to give, there's so many ways that we can take action. And I shared, I shared that example of like that conversation in my family. And I really want to honor that's an expression of action and how we can disrupt our current kind of toxic political culture, right? So one great form of action right now, and especially for those of us living in the United States, right, is just bringing more civility, right, into our political culture. And that often starts through the political conversations we're having in our own lives, right? So compassion is such a force for transforming our politics right now, and we need to do that. Two other short examples. In New York City, there is a group called the Buddhist Action Coalition. Possibly some of you know of it or have even experienced it, but they host public meditations for peace and justice, right? Right now, it's often really being vocal for peace for Palestine and in Gaza and in Israel, and just, helping bring peace to that part of the world. And so the Buddhist Action Coalition, you can check them out online. They're doing amazing work, and you can gather with other like-minded people and actually meditate together, but also, be a vocal presence for peace and justice. And then lastly, for those of us who care a lot about the natural world and our Mother Earth, there's an organization called One Earth Sangha. And they have something called the Eco-Sattva training, right? So building off the Bodhisattva archetype, the Eco-Sattva training is, I think it's only like, an 8-week journey you can take to really dive deep into kind of your own environmental calling around how you can help, be it, ending climate change or, caring for the environment in other ways. So there are just so many things happening already. And of course, if you're a Buddhist practitioner, even if you're engaging with, a more traditional nonprofit, right, that is your form of engaged Buddhism, as someone who's practicing Buddhism and also working alongside, other folks in the social and environmental sector.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Joshua. So many good practical examples, and we'll make sure to grab those links, put them in a follow-up email in case you missed them. So to you, Justin, what are some practical steps individuals can take to apply these teachings in their daily lives and communities?
I'm going to come around to, Joshua talked about some more like practical kind of steps in specific organizations and, voting and those kind of things. And I'm going to talk more maybe from the perspective of just like implementing traditional practices in a way that they influence your life and like really bringing things off the cushion. And so a big part of that, and this is going to sound contradictory, is actually be on the cushion enough that your practice is carrying over into your life. So there's one aspect that, it's easy to take a spiritually minded attitude and then want to do things in the world. But if that's not informed by actual practice and experience on the cushion, it can really become like, this slippery slope of becoming something that's sometimes called spiritual materialism, where we kind of like assume a spiritual air and then do a lot of things in the world from that air, but actually they could just be reinforcing our own sense of pride or ego or identity in a way that's counterproductive to an actual Buddhist path. So, in terms of implementing practices, for one, hopefully, be doing some actual practice in the first place, like on the cushion practice, whether that's shamatha, vipassana, tantric sadhana, whatever the level of practice you may be at or whatever tradition you're practicing in. And in terms of like bringing that in the world, in terms of these practices like the 6 perfections, for example, it's important to address and be realistic about your own weak spots. For example, if I'm really triggered and prone to anger, then I need to be working more with like the methods described in all the teachings on the perfection of patience. If I'm kind of like miserly and only thinking about myself and kind of greedy, I need to be practicing more of the 4 immeasurables, maybe also going into like more generosity. Even generosity doesn't have to be about money. It can be about sharing your time. It can be about looking people in the eye and smiling and connecting with them instead of hiding away. There's a lot of different ways that can reflect, but like looking at your own kind of weak points, like if I'm hyper caught up in distraction with all kinds of things in the world or social media or whatever, I should focus more on the paramita, the perfection of concentration, do some more shamatha practice, and not necessarily just do the practice, but also to recognize I'm super involved in all these things that are really distracting and draining my energy and not bringing me in a direction I want to go in. So there's one side is practice, one side is recognizing that I'm engaging in a lot of things that are maybe harmful or counterproductive and maybe intentionally reducing that. So there's different ways, and one of them really just, from what I'm speaking from, requires a lot of like personal sense of responsibility and self-awareness about seeing our own blind spots or seeing our weak points. Khen Rinpoche often talks about, at the end of a weekend retreat of teaching about shamatha or some meditation, he'll often say, meditation alone is not going to do the trick. That's why there is the perfection of discipline. And in the perfection of discipline, it's often about, on a fundamental level, it's about not doing certain things that are counterproductive or that are harmful. And so if I am constantly getting triggered or angry in certain situations or with my parents or with whatever, there's one thing is to work on the methods for developing loving kindness, trying to see their perspective, all the different ways that you could overcome anger in that kind of contemplative practice way. There's another way that is the commitment. I'm not going to get angry at my father or my boss or whatever. And making that another aspect of the commitment is this side of discipline. So, approaching all of our weak spots, and that could apply in this distraction area too. Okay, I'm going to quit looking at social media, or I'm going to only use it for what I need it for, and if I need it for my job or some communications. So there's different ways. Like the perfection of concentration could be, I'm going to practice meditation more, and I'm going to make an actual commitment to not be as involved in all these distracting things in my life. And so if you're practicing I'm speaking very generally, but if you were practicing this as an aspect of a path of a bodhisattva, meaning someone who is like actually dedicated to the enlightenment of all beings, then also all those practices should be done with that as the intention. Like, I'm going to practice generosity to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. I'm going to overcome my anger for that same purpose. I'm going to develop my concentration for that same purpose. So, that's another way, to summarize, to first actually be engaged in a practice on the cushion, and then secondly, to start to try to allow that to reflect outwardly in ways where, initially I think it's good to target our particular weak points and start working through those.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Justin. And Joshua, anything that's sparking for you?
No, that's
Oh, let me just
thank
follow
you.
up one more thing. I'm spacing where this quote comes from. It may be from the Buddha. It may have been from Shantideva in The Way of the Bodhisattva. But in terms of this practice of a bodhisattva's quest for enlightenment, they say that in terms of which brings a greater blessing or benefit, like transformational value, is it the Buddha or is it sentient beings? And he said it's sentient beings, because the Buddha gave us the teachings, but it's in the way that we relate with the world and other beings that we actually reflect that transformation in ourselves. So we can't perfect our sense of patience if we don't have someone who's causing us to be upset. So we have to work with beings in the world to develop those kind of qualities.
So next, we're going to take a look at the question, how can we balance personal spiritual development with the desire to affect social change?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to throw it back to Justin.
I think that they're not at odds with each other. It can be a matter of managing one's time. So, in terms of what I was just talking about, the engaged aspect, then all of that, those kinds of engagements I'm talking about working where your weak spots are, those can all equally apply to the way you're acting in any kind of organization or any of the types of activism Joshua was talking about. For example, developing patience, your sense of generosity, giving your time towards different various causes, developing patience, having a sense of discipline. All of those aspects can apply to that. And I think that we're in a world where in the early days of early Buddhism, and specifically in the earliest teachings that we might think of as carried by the Theravada tradition these days, the Buddha was talking mainly to people who had renounced ordinary worldly life and were living as renunciate monastics. And for 90+% of people in the West who are practicing Buddhism, that's not the case. And so we have no choice but to be in the world, and therefore to have some way that we are contributing to society in one way or another, be that good or bad. And that can be in the way that we choose to spend our time, the way that we choose to spend our money, the way that the way that we spend our time in terms of, it could be in distracted activities, or if we're so called to, we could spend that in more so-called productive activities, which can be activist things, or they could be like purely spiritual practice things, and I think those are equally valid paths. And there's also overlap, there's also service towards Dharma organizations and things like that. Like there's plenty of volunteer opportunities here in Montana to help out at the Buddha Garden, for example, and so forth. Help organize events, to help clean the garden, to help all those kind of things. So, it's just a matter of like balancing. I think that it's like what I was saying before, that if the spiritual like groundwork isn't being laid, then it's hard to like pretend or make a pretense of a spiritual way of engaging in your activism. You can, and it's not like all fake, like and people's intentions matter, but I think that like the deeper grounding and the deeper kind of qualities that you develop through the spiritual path, which is mainly done by sitting down on the cushion and really developing the practices, then that is like what is going to activate those qualities Joshua talked about when we first started, of having that fortitude and that patience and that resistance to burnout and whatever kind of activism that you're going to do. And then once you have that grounding, and especially once you reach a certain point and gain some more stability in the practice, then the activism becomes an extension of that, and they don't have to be two separate things. You don't have to think of like a competition between my spiritual practice and my activism or something like that. The activism, I think for a lot of Buddhist people, it's seen as an extension of their commitment to free beings from suffering and so forth. So, yeah. I think we can turn it over to Joshua then.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Yeah, our lives are full, and these times are just filled with so much need. And so balance is such a tricky path. I know we all are navigating that. I want to share a provocation. And so I want to invite, for those of you, if you're someone who is less active in the world or in your community, be it, if you're less active through forms of service or social action, I want to encourage you maybe to explore, getting more active and engaged and pushing your comfort zone there. And also, if you're someone who comes to this conversation who does a lot of service, right? And you, maybe it's just your job in the world, right? Is very service oriented. Many of us have those professions. If you're someone who's been active, engaged for decades, but you haven't done as much spiritual practice, you haven't done an extended retreat, I want to encourage you to maybe, consider signing up for something deeper and longer. Because I think it's real. We have to taste both. And some of us may already have a really nice balance of both, and so we know personally the power of that. But often it's a dance, right? We have to go deep sometimes, in one way or the other, right? To really come to a place of balance. I also want to honor that there are so many seasons in our lives, different seasons, and also different stages in our lives, right? And so, for some of us, being really active and engaged in the world maybe is not right for this moment in your life, right? And spending more time in study and practice really is where you're at and what's being called for. I know in my own life, again, I'm I still identify as a younger, but I'm increasingly acknowledging that I'm fully midlife. But so I've had a good couple decades, as a active, engaged person in the world, there's just many different moments, right? So I've learned to just honor the rhythms of each season, and that's its own form of balance, right? So balance isn't always like in equal parts. We can create these expectations for ourselves of how it has to look and be, but life is so much more messy and beautiful, than those ideas we often hold. I want to briefly also point, one of the greatest sources of balance and resilience that I know as an engaged Buddhist is it comes from the Sangha circles that I'm a part of. And so just specifically as someone who's been a part of many learning circles at Namchak, I'll be transparent. Emily and I we've sat in many circles, but we're in a current learning circle, and it's a small circle, but we have the gift of many of us in that circle are engaged Buddhists. We are deeply committed to our practice. Many of us are engaged in the Nundro practice, but we also are going out, on the weekends or in the evenings and engaging in our communities. And when, as a Sangha, there's something that happens when I gather in those circles. I am both re-inspired to dedicate myself again to sitting on the cushion, right, and taking my practice even further. But also, when I hear their stories of how they're engaging in the world, I'm also re-inspired to dedicate myself to be of service, right, to help make the difference I know is possible. And when we are practicing by ourselves, and also when we are acting more by ourselves too, it can get lonely, it can get hard, right? So there's something powerful that the gift of Sangha brings to both our practice and our action. And so if you're not someone who already is experiencing the benefit of Sangha, Namchak is a great resource with its learning circles, but just gathering some of your like-minded friends together is also just, one of the best places to bring that forth into your life.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joshua. Shout out to our Sunday morning learning circle. Justin, anything sparking for you based on what Joshua shared around?
Not particularly. I think we can move on to the next. Question?
Oh, sorry. I think we might be having some tech difficulties and some breaking up. I was just wondering if there's anything that sparked for you based on what Joshua shared, particularly around community or Sangha or these pieces.
Not particularly, but I think I get that feedback a lot from people that the learning circles are really meaningful. They help keep them on the track in terms of their practice, kind of a sense of accountability, and also a sense of, as a person who's trying to get involved deeper in some kind of spiritual community, a lot of times there aren't necessarily that many people directly in your physical community, and so it can feel kind of lonely and isolating at times. So it's good to have a group, even a virtual group, to meet with and connect on the practices and connect in and check in about life and lifestyle, and like Joshua said, different kind of activist things. If that's where your energy is going, it's good to connect with other people who are doing that and get that shared kind of maybe enthusiasm. And even there might be times when you're not feeling enthusiastic and you're feeling kind of disheartened by your journey, whether it's your spiritual journey or your activist journey, and that can be reinvigorated by having that kind of community. So yeah, it's super helpful.
Great. And then you're actually leading us into our last question, which we could start with you, Justin, which is, what challenges might arise when trying to live an engaged Buddhist life, and how can we overcome them?
If I had to sum up the biggest obstacles, they are hope and fear, or expectation and fear. And those can become like total blockages, or doubt, I guess. Doubt's another big one. And another, really crucial piece of the practice of the six perfections, like for example, in the practice of generosity, which will apply a lot in terms of like someone's engagement in the sense that we're speaking of in terms of social engagement or something like that. Let's say I'm giving my time, or I'm giving some money, or I'm giving some effort to a particular organization. Having a lot of expectation about particular outcomes can have a really seriously problematic, result coming from that, in that can be one of the main causes of burnout, I think, when you have so much expectation and then things don't go the way you hoped that they would, or the way that you People often invest their time or money or effort into things with particular expectations of outcomes. Like, even in the simple act of giving someone $10 and you hope that they're going to use it for food and then they buy alcohol with it or something like that. From a strictly Buddhist perspective of like what happens in that interaction, there's like, if I have a gift that I give and I give it without hope of reward or without any expectation of what they'll do with it, and I purely wish for it to benefit them, and particularly from the Bodhicitta perspective, I wish that this will help them alleviate suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment, then that's a pure gift, and that the merit, the virtue, the good habit maybe that I'm implanting in myself for continuing in that path of generosity is untarnished, it's perfected, something like that, if I can maintain that kind of attitude. But if I don't have that and I load it with a lot of expectation, I hope they actually spend it on this, and then I find out they spend it on that, then I regret the whole situation. I regret ever giving in the first place. That destroys whatever kind of merit I ever had in doing the good thing in the first place of giving that act of generosity. So I think that one of the biggest ways that someone in an activist space can make sure that like the thing that they're doing contributes to their spiritual practice, but also it's probably the best attitude to carry into that space in the first place for the betterment of the environment, like the vibe amongst the other people who are working together, and for the potential outcomes of the project, whatever that is, would be to have this kind of attitude that I'm giving my best, hoping for the best potential benefit, the maximum benefit. And if you're a bodhisattva, then I would transform that even so. If you're a bodhisattva, meaning if you're practicing on the path of the bodhisattva in this Mahayana Buddhist context, that you do it all with the intention, may this gift of my service or whatever it is be a cause for the benefit of all beings, for them to be free of suffering and for them to attain the state of enlightenment. And if you can approach it with that attitude and without all these expectations, of course, when things don't go the right way, you can course correct. You can say in an honest, open conversation with the other people in the nonprofit you work for or whatever, that didn't work, we should go this way. But if that's loaded with like all these unnecessary expectations and regrets, then that is putting a heavy burden on yourself that probably leads to that kind of burnout, and also contributes to, in a strictly Buddhist sense, a destruction of an elimination of whatever kind of virtue or wholesomeness that there was in you doing that is destroyed by the fact that you regret ever doing it in the first place. So and when we talk about that, that gets into a deeper discussion of karma. What is karma in terms of like positive maybe habituation in this context? Like you're hoping to create more and more of an inclination for yourself to keep doing these kinds of things. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Like if you do it without expectation and you maintain that virtuous kind of momentum of whatever activity that is, I'm speaking of generosity just as a general example, but whatever the case may be, meditation or whatever, if you approach it without expectation of a particular outcome and you just keep going forward with that wholesome attitude and intention, then that is going to be a self-fueling kind of vehicle of development, of spiritual progress, and also in your potential to keep doing the things that you're doing in the world. And otherwise, having too much expectation or too much fear of like success or failure, in either direction, fear and expectation, is setting up a lot of roadblocks for, blocking your attainment of more wholesome qualities in terms of your development on the path, like as a Buddhist, but also obstacles for your capacity for continuing in whatever avenue of work you're trying to go in. And I think that doesn't just apply in activist type of work. That would apply in anything that you're doing in your life, but it also is particularly applicable in this context because so many people get what they call compassion burnout, or just burnout in general through like, feeling like they overextend themselves or whatever. So, there's one side, which is to approach it with the attitudes I've just been talking about. The other side, which is to have honest, realistic kind of boundaries and to know your limits. Like I can give this much and still maintain the balance in my life and with my family and my other commitments and not feel overextended, So I think there's, this more strictly spiritual side. Then there is, like I said before, in that Bodhisattva vow ceremony, there is I will train after the other Bodhisattvas step by step, meaning you don't have to throw out everything all at once. Like to perfect the perfection of generosity doesn't mean to give away everything you own all at once, because that's actually going to, for most people, lead to intense regret and a situation where you destabilize yourself, so you get thrown off your path and aren't able to continue forward in your spiritual path or your maybe activist path or whatever. So there's always that balance there that can to be contributing, like the attitude of the spiritual path, but not getting head over heels into the spiritual path to a level to which your actual experience and practice hasn't caught up to yet, because like what can happen to a lot of people is they get enamored with the ideals of the spiritual path. They want to dive in head first, then they find out really quickly that their practice actually isn't up to the level of diving in head first, and then they have to dial it back. And maybe it's important to actually go through that to have a direct experience of that, but at a certain point, I think there is also a bit of a reality check in like, okay, what is my capacity, and how can I keep that in balance in a way that makes this a sustainable venture in terms of how much I'm putting into practice, how much I'm putting into various ventures in my life, and being clear and realistic about those kind of things. So, yeah. Joshua?
I love everything you shared, and you really spoke to, I think, the heart, of what I feel called to share too. So I'm going to be brief, but really speak to some of the same things I think you were touching on. I think one of the greatest challenges we face is that it's just hard to be engaged in the world. And I'll speak for myself. I often find it hard, and it's often easier for me to stay home or for me to be by myself. Both the effort and, the disappointment that can happen when we're trying to make a difference in the world is hard, but just working with other people, right? Like we trigger each other, we frustrate each other, we slow each other down, we step on each other's toes. And so it's hard. And so I think a challenge is that in the face of it being hard, right, that we do step back and we do play it safe maybe more than we actually could, right? And so I think that's the power of authentic spiritual practice as we really begin to embody it and realize in our lives the freedom and courage that comes forth, and of course the compassion, right? It makes so much possible, right, for engaged Buddhists in the world. So I think more than ever we need Buddhists who are becoming actively engaged, because we are cultivating superpowers that our world needs, that our culture needs, that our friends and families and communities need, right? So ultimately, as Justin was speaking to, it is hard to be a bodhisattva in the world, and I really believe there is a fine art to it. And so folding our service and our activism into our practice life, it changes the quality of how we're engaging. And I'll just briefly share, I often will set my, if I have some project or action or, again, form of service I'm engaging in, as I go into it, I will meditate ahead of time. I will set my altruistic intention. And then as I'm engaging in the world, and I'm being vague in general because there's so many different forms and expressions of it, but I'm also engaging with awareness, and I'm noticing how am I feeling in my heart and in my mind and in my body, and what's coming up and what's triggering me, or what's frustrating me, what are the social dynamics at play in whatever context I'm in, right? How is power at play, right, in social dynamics, so that the awareness we cultivate in our practice is a powerful tool, right, for social dynamics, right? Are there forms of racism and sexism and ableism, right, at play in these dynamics? And as someone who cares about, uprooting those things, right, it's really important for me to be tracking those things. And then in the wake of my actions or service, then slowing down again and sitting on the cushion and reflecting on what I learned, what came up, and then dedicating, the merit of that engagement. It folds it all right into my practice life, my practice path, and it helps me overcome just the challenge of the hard work that it can be, right? To really be out there, doing my best to move things forward, even if it's just a few small steps forward in the right direction.